hello there and welcome to another episode of Survival Tips for Parents Raising Anxious Kids. My name is Natasha Daniels. I'm an anxiety and OCD therapist, and I'm making this video and this series in collaboration with Made of Millions Foundation. So today I want to talk to you about accommodation. It's a fancy word that we throw out a lot when we're talking about our role in helping our anxious kids. And it's kind of like a nasty word, but I want to take the stigma away from accommodations, and I want to talk to you about what it is and what we can do to prevent it from happening. So kids who have anxiety don't live in a bubble. They are in families, they are in our houses, they're in my house, and we impact their anxiety, and their anxiety impacts us. And so even if your child is not ready to work on their anxiety, or even if your child is not even wanting to admit they have anxiety, that doesn't mean there's not something that you can do to make some progress in the situation. And that's actually good news, because a lot of times I'll talk to parents and they'll feel like, I don't know what to do, Natasha. I don't know where to go because my child doesn't want to work on this, or my child doesn't want to talk about their anxiety, or they don't want to see a therapist. Are you experiencing that? And even if your child is willing to go see a therapist and is trying to work on it, you might ask yourself, what am I supposed to do? What's my job in this? Because that can be very confusing. And so that is what today's episode is all about. The parent's role. What can we do to make things better? What can we do to make things worse? None of us want to make things worse, but some of us are unintentionally doing that. There are things that I do in my own home, raising my 3 kids with anxiety, that I know does not help. Because sometimes we just intuitively do things and then afterwards we're like, oh man, that was tricky. So this is not a black and white thing. This is a gray thing. But knowledge is key. So if I can give you the information that will help you understand the ways that we help accommodate anxiety, then you will know what to avoid. It's like a minefield. And the more you know where those mines are, the more you'll be able to zigzag through and have more success. So I am going to give you the most common accommodations that we as parents raising anxious kids tend to do for our kids, and I'll talk to you about how it doesn't help the anxiety and what to do instead. All right, so let's get started. So let's start off with number 1. When we help our kids avoid the things that make them anxious, we are accommodating the anxiety, and we're not teaching our kids to walk towards their fears, and we're teaching them to walk away from them. And this is counterintuitive, because when we have kids who are anxious, it is our mama or dada bear in us that says, let's protect them. If they're really anxious about that, let's not make them do that. Or let's find a shortcut, or let's find a simple solution so they don't have to get upset. That is very, very much a maternal or paternal gut instinct. And when we're raising anxious kids, kids that have anxiety disorders or have a big predisposition to anxiety, or kids in general, actually, if we want to build resilience in any child, that's not the message we want to convey. And that is super tricky, because parentally we might want to put them in a bubble, get that shrink wrap and bubble them up and say, no one will ever hurt you. You will never experience discomfort. We got you. But kids can't live in a bubble, and it's probably not healthy anyway. The air is probably very bad. So we have to teach our kids to walk towards their fears. Now, that doesn't mean that we throw them into their fears and we say, get over there and do that because you need to face your fears. Or we throw a baby in the swimming pool and we expect it to swim. It's not that extreme. It's teaching them that there is a gray. It's not black or white. They can inchworm their way towards the things that make them scared. So instead of enabling it, which we do a lot, and I am so guilty of this myself, a lot of times we'll walk on eggshells and we will know the things that will trigger our kids, and so we don't do them. And we know the events and activities that will upset our kids, so we don't sign them up for them. And we know the situations that will be upsetting, and so maybe we avoid them. Maybe we call people for them. We smooth out that road so they don't feel any bumps. And we want their road to be a little bumpy so they can learn how to drive over the bumpy road. So you might say to your child, I know that's really scary, but if we can take one step towards that fear instead of one step away from that fear, you're going to be crushing your anxiety. And that's what I do with my kids at home. For example, if my son is afraid to go into another room because it's dark or it's scary, I might say to him, if I go in there and turn that light on for you, then I am never teaching you how to face your fears. And your anxiety is just 1 for anxiety, 0 for you. And I don't want that. So even if we take 1 step towards your fear instead of 1 step away, you're going to be crushing your anxiety. And so I might say, what's 1 little step you can do to move towards your fear? And sometimes my son might say, well, I can, if you can come with me, and then I'll turn the light on. And sometimes that's the best that we're going to do. And that's great because we still did something that his anxiety didn't want him to do. He turned on that light even though I was there. And then as we progress, I might say, can you go and turn the light on and I will stay here in the hall. And then as we progress, I might say, I'm right here. You go all the way down the hall, go to your room and turn the light on yourself. And so you inchworm your way to success. But you want to always ask your kids, what is the 1 step you can make towards your anxiety instead of 1, not giving them an opportunity to even face their anxiety, because a lot of us do that, where our kids don't even know if they'd be anxious because we don't give them an opportunity. Or 2, we pave the way. And so we make sure it's nice and smooth. So that's number 1, make sure that we are not teaching them to avoid their fears. We're not teaching them that we hit that emergency exit and we get out of there before we even begin. Number 2 is providing them with reassurance and not teaching them how to think and reframe their thinking for themselves. So what does that mean? It means one of the most powerful ways to teach kids to beat their anxiety is through their thoughts. And I am a cognitive behavioral therapist, so I'm very heavy on the cognitive, and kids will have anxious thoughts, and those anxious thoughts will create physiological responses in their body. And those physiological responses in their body will make them feel more anxious. And that anxiety that they're feeling will make them want to avoid. And the more they avoid, the more thoughts they have. And this circle goes around and around. So the best way to beat anxiety from going on repeat is to tackle those thoughts. There is nothing quicker than attacking thoughts and bringing that emergency alarm bell quieter or off. And so how do we do that? Well, in my online programs, in my online class, How to Teach Your Kids to Crush Anxiety, I talk about red thoughts and green thoughts. And that's just a visual for kids to see in a cognitive behavioral sort of way that we have red thoughts, we have anxious thoughts, and we want to combat them or reframe them with green thoughts, positive thoughts that are related to the fear. And that does take a lot of the power of the anxiety away, which in return shuts down a lot of those physiological responses. But unfortunately, us great parents want to swoop in and save the day. I am totally guilty of that. I'm still guilty of that. It's something I'll catch myself doing all the time. And so when my child is anxious, I swoop in and I give them their green thoughts. And so if my child says, oh, I'm worried I might throw up today, because emetophobia, the fear of throw up, is a very common fear, and it's one that lives very loudly in my house. And so I might swoop in and I might say, you're not going to throw up today. Honey, you're fine. You never throw up. It's okay. Now that sounds like a really good mom thing to say, right? Or my son is scared to go to bed and I swoop in and I say, you're safe in this house. I'm right here. Don't worry about it. So you might be saying to yourself, okay, Natasha, those sound like really normal mom or dad things to say. And they are, but we can't parent in a normal way when we're parenting an anxious kid. Not if we want to build up their resiliency and not if we want to build up their adaptability. We have to parent in a very counterintuitive sort of way. That doesn't mean we're cruel. I was an anxious child as a young kid, as a teenager, and even as an adult. And so I get it. And I'm raising 3 anxious kids. So I am not wanting to be insensitive or push them over the edge. However, I do get that if I spoon feed them these positive thoughts, if I spoon feed them these reframing ways of thinking about their anxiety, I'm doing them a disservice because I'm not teaching them how to think for themselves. Because ultimately the power comes when a child can give themselves green thoughts. And that doesn't happen automatically. In fact, the majority of adults out there can't even give themselves green thoughts, right? We may even have a hard time giving ourselves green thoughts. So how are we expecting a child to be able to do that? We have to train them. And the training has to be rather intentional. So let's take an example. Let's say my son is afraid to go to bed at night and he's worried about the dark and he's worried about bad guys. And so he says from his bedroom, Mom, I'm scared, I can't sleep. And so perhaps if this is a reoccurring thing, let's say your child has a reoccurring anxiety, or a reoccurring situation that you know comes up every day or a few times a week, the best thing to do is to sit with them when they're not in that situation and go over it with them. And so you might want to say to your child, what are all the anxious thoughts, let's call them red thoughts, that you have that make you nervous when you're going to bed at night? Let's just use that as an example. And then your child might say, well, I'm worried that a bad guy might break in. I'm worried that you guys are going to fall asleep before me. I'm worried that someone's going to break in through my window. I'm worried maybe someone's watching me. These are all common, by the way. I'm using really common examples. And then you might say to your child, let's think of some green thoughts. What are some green thoughts that you can give yourself when you're feeling that way? Now, they may not be able to come up with any. And I find that every kid is wired differently. So some kids can come up with green thoughts really quickly. Their mind is able to just, generate these alternative ways of thinking. And some of the kids I work with in my practice have no ability to come up with green thoughts. And I do feel like there's almost like a genetic predisposition to thinking this way. Some kids just don't have that ability. And so they really have to train their brain harder than some other kids. So if your child's having a hard time coming up with green thoughts, then you might want to slowly spoon feed them some ideas of green thoughts, but then you want them to foster those thoughts and come up with more on their own. And it is okay if you have to just come up with green thoughts for them in the beginning, because not every kid will come up with them. They'll just be like, I've got nothing. I have nothing. And so you might say, well, why are we safe in this house? I don't know, because you're here. When it comes to sleep, and I talk about this in my sleep class, you don't want your kids to think that they're safe in the house because of you. Now I know, again, that seems completely counterintuitive, but if they're dependent on you because you keep them safe, then they're going to want to be near you. They're going to want to make sure that you're up. They're going to want to make sure that you're watching them and checking on them because you're guarding the house. We don't want them to think you're guarding the house, because if that's the case, they're going to have a really hard time sleeping. So our green thoughts would be unrelated to us. And so we might say, why are we safe in this house? Why am I safe in this house? Oh, because the doors are locked, or the windows are locked, or we have an alarm, or we live in a safe neighborhood, or whatever, fill in the blank. So when you have your child generate those green thoughts, then when they're having a hard time, and I'm just using sleep as an example, but it can literally be anything, you can say, what can you tell yourself? Now, sometimes when you say to kids, what are your green thoughts? They don't like that, and they might bite your head off. So there's that. But just because your child reacts in a hostile way doesn't mean that you give up. You just have to find a different avenue or a different language to convey that to your kids. What can you tell yourself? And even if they're like, I don't care about green thoughts, those are stupid, it doesn't matter. Then you pull back and you don't say anything. But over time, we're planting seeds. We're teaching kids that there is an alternative way to think of things, and that you are teaching them to think of them on their own. They're not dependent on you. So the next time your child swoops in and says, Mom, I'm worried about blah, 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 then you prompt them, I'm sorry that your anxiety is bothering you. Or if you've named it, which would be even better, I'm sorry Mr. Worry is bothering you. Or I'm sorry your dictator is bothering you. What can you tell it to fight back? What's something you can say? And start to plant those seeds. Okay, on to number 3. Sometimes we over-identify with our child's anxiety and we over-normalize it. And so the apple sometimes doesn't fall from the genetic tree. And I've said that before in other episodes. And I am guilty of this myself because I have anxiety, my kids have anxiety. But we have to keep ourselves in check. So sometimes, and I see this a lot in my practice, and I do see it in my own home as well, is we over-identify with our children's anxiety because we are anxious about the exact same things. And so we normalize it to the point where it's not healthy. So I love to normalize anxiety in a general sort of way and tell our kids, hey, everybody has anxiety. You just have a very overprotective lifeguard in your brain. We all have lifeguards, but yours seems to be super overprotective, and so does mine. And so it's going to make us worry about things that other people don't worry about. And here are the superpowers about anxiety. I always like to highlight that you're very kind-hearted and you're intelligent, and these are all really good things. But when we over-identify with anxiety to the point where we are in cahoots with anxiety itself and not our child, then we're not empowering our children to fight back. And so sometimes I'll see this in my practice where the parent will say, isn't it normal to be anxious about this? Or isn't it normal to do this behavior? And it's not typical behavior. And so they are having an anxiety response to something, and they're also conveying to their child that that's normal, that's a normal response. So you want to check and double check your own behavior and talk to your friends and family, or talk to your own therapist if you have one, and ask them, what is typical? What is normal? I have had families that I've worked with in my practice where the entire family was acting in a very anxious sort of way, and they all looked at me like I was crazy when I was trying to incorporate typical responses to what they were talking about. And so that makes it really hard for the child if they are doing better, or they're trying to do better than their parents, because their parents are responding in a very anxious sort of way, and they are starting to get empowered and acting in a different sort of way. So ask yourself what you're anxious about. I know for me, I am very sensitive to social anxiety issues because I have social anxiety. So I might over accommodate when my kids are doing something that I feel can be negative or can be misconstrued or can get them rejected. I might cocoon them from that. So that's one of my accommodations that I have to keep in check. Or I might get oversensitive when someone says something to them or doesn't invite them somewhere. My social anxiety will kick in and say, oh my gosh, why don't they like you? I think I just saw them roll their eyes at you. Or I think they invited everybody else in the class but you. And I have to check and double check my responses. And sometimes I'll use my husband as a sounding board and say, was that rude? Because that seemed really rude to me. And he'll say, no, they were just busy. And I'll realize that I'm putting my own social anxiety onto the situation. So, and then I won't say anything, because we don't want to convey our own anxiety issues to our kids and then validate their anxiety or even create a new anxiety theme in them. So check your own anxiety and make sure that you have a good base of what is a typical response and what is maybe an anxiety response. Number 4, sometimes we are talking to anxiety and we are not talking to our child. Anxiety loves to chat with you, and you may not even be aware of that. Anxiety will ask for reassurance. It will ask for guidance. It will ask you to fix things. It will ask you to tell them what to do. Anxiety is talking to you half the time if you're raising an anxious child. And your job is to be able to differentiate. Are you talking to your child, or are you talking to anxiety? Because if we're talking to anxiety, we want to have a certain conversation with that. We want to empower our kids, and we don't want to spoon feed our kids thoughts and feelings and behaviors that will fix the issue, because they're not going to learn. And sometimes if our kids have OCD, we're doing a compulsion and we are really completing that OCD loop. So you want to be very careful about how you're talking to your child and what kind of questions they're asking. So for example, if my child says to me, Mom, I'm not feeling well, can you take my temperature? Well, if my child has health anxiety and they're asking if they're sick all the time, daily or weekly, am I sick? Can you check? Then me answering them, honey, you're fine, honey, you're fine, honey, you're fine, is not providing them any ability to tell themselves that they're fine, to talk to themselves, to use those green thoughts that I talked about, to give them their own reassurance that they're going to be okay no matter what happens, even if they get sick. And so in our simple response, which is totally intuitive and is a normal parent thing to do, we're not giving them that wiggle room to build their own skills. So a lot of this is counterintuitive. So if my child says, I don't feel well, then my response, which is going to sound totally weird, let's say we call it Mr. Worry, I would say, it sounds like Mr. Worry's bothering you. What can you tell Mr. Worry? And so I'm coaching my child to, 1, identify when they're having an anxious thought, and 2, how to provide their own green thoughts, how to reframe their own thinking to squash that anxiety and to bring it back down. And so sometimes it's not providing themselves reassurance. It's saying, if I get sick, I'll be okay. Or, you always make me feel like I'm sick. Every day you make me feel like I'm sick, and most of the days I'm fine. Very rarely am I sick, so I'm going to be ignoring you. But thank you, but no, right? So we're teaching our kids their own green thoughts by calling out their anxiety when they're asking us anxiety questions. Maybe your child is eating dinner and they're like, Mom, is this expired? Or did you check the expiration date when you cooked, right? Now, if you know that's one of your child's themes, that they worry about expiration dates, then you're not going to answer that in a very normal mom sort of way. You're not going to be like, yes, honey, I check it every time, you're fine. Now, that's a nice, normal mom thing to do, but inadvertently, we're missing an opportunity to coach our child to do things for themselves, because we're not going to always be there. We're not going to be there when they're going to bed at night and they're scared in the dark, or when they're eating something that they don't know if it's expired or not, or if they're starting to feel sick and they're worried that they might throw up. We're not going to be there in life for them, always by their side saying, "You're fine, honey, you're fine." They're 30, "You're fine, honey." They're calling you up, "Am I okay?" "You're okay." We don't want that, right? That's not healthy. And so we have to start pulling back at a young age and building up that resiliency and adaptability. And in fact, when we do that, even though I know some anxious parents feel like that's cruel, we are building up their self-esteem, because a child who can take care of themselves, regardless of whether they have anxiety or not, feels super empowered. A child who depends on their parent to make them feel okay, and depends on their parent to self-regulate, and depends on their parent to feel like they're safe, feels insecure, and their self-esteem tends to be lower because they know that they can't take care of themselves. So this is really good stuff for self-esteem, for self-efficacy, and for anxiety. So when your child says something like, "Did you cook this?" or "Is this expired?" then you might say, "Your dictator won't even let you enjoy dinner. That's so annoying for you. I'm so sorry that your dictator wants to be part of this conversation," right? I try to use humor. It doesn't always work. It depends on your family and your style, but we use humor in my house so that it's not demeaning. We're not judging. We're all in it together and we can laugh at it. And so then I might say something like, "What can you tell your dictator about that?" Or depending on where you are with therapy and how advanced your child is, sometimes we use sarcasm at my house. So I might say, "Yep, we're all going to die of food poisoning tonight. It was so good knowing you. I love you all." I'll use humor because that's my style, and it depends on your family. But you want to ideally get your child to answer their anxiety back. And what you're doing in that instance is two things. One, you're labeling anxiety, because a lot of times kids are not even aware of what is an anxious thought versus what is maybe a typical thought. And two, you're inviting them to an anxiety battle. Hey, do you want to go at it with your anxiety? Do you want to reframe their thinking? Do you want to throw a green thought at it? What can you do in this moment? Because in this moment, you're training them for many moments to come where they can be independent and fight these things. Or a lot of times they have anxious thoughts in their head and you're not even privy to it, and they'll have the power to fight back. And that's really what it's all about, is independence and giving them the skills to be able to reframe their own thinking. On to number 5. Number 5 is not allowing our children to feel anxiety. And I know that can sound really weird, but a lot of times we think as parents that our kids are not allowed to have bad feelings. And so if they're not just happy, then we need to fix that. And if we have anxiety, we may even feel that even more so, because we might be anxious. We might be an anxious parent. And we might want to think, I just want my child happy all the time. I don't want them angry. I don't want them disappointed. I don't want them to be anxious. And so if they have any emotion outside of happy, I need to swoop in and fix that. So I'm exerting a lot of effort. If my child is anxious or sad, I'm swooping in and I'm like, happy, happy dance. Let's do this. Let's have popcorn. Let's do this. And I'm putting a lot of energy into it because I don't want them to sit in any discomfort. And that's really inadvertently conveying the wrong message. We want our kids to know that it is okay to not be okay sometimes. It is okay to feel anxious. It is okay to feel nervous. But it's just what you do in those moments that count, right? So we don't want to convey to our kids they can't have these moods, they can't have this anxiety, or they can't have this anger or annoyance. It's okay to have those feelings because that's what makes us all human. But what are we going to do about it? So if I'm feeling really anxious, that's okay. But I'm still going to go to that party, or I'm still going to go to bed at night, or I'm still going to go and do this thing, even though I'm feeling anxious. I'll give you an example. When my daughter goes to a birthday party, she gets very anxious because she is worried that she might throw up. And so that's part of her anxiety theme. So when we're getting in the car, a lot of times, and she's only 8, she'll say, "Mom, I'm feeling really anxious." And now I don't swoop in and say, "Oh, honey, you shouldn't be nervous. Don't worry, you shouldn't be anxious because you've been to birthday parties before and you always do okay," and blah, 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 blah. Now I know that sounds like normal mom stuff, right? So you might be like, "Natasha, that sounds pretty good. That's kind of what I say to my kids." And yes, it is normal to say those things. But it is better if we say something like this. Of course you're anxious. This is what I say to my daughter. Of course you're anxious. And she calls her anxiety her O cloud, because she has OCD as well. And so I will say, of course you're anxious. O cloud's going to show up, right? Because O cloud knows this makes you nervous. And so, yeah, you're going to be anxious, and that's okay. We all feel anxious sometimes. What can you tell your O cloud? And then I'm prompting her to go into her green thoughts, right? And so at that point, she's been well trained. She'll say, oh, well, I always go to these parties and I do okay. And I always feel this way, but normally after the first 15 minutes, I start to feel better. She'll say these things to herself. Now, it didn't start off that way. We would have a lot of tears, a lot of meltdowns, a lot of I don't want to go. But over time, consistently kind of inchworming our way to these parties and building up her green thoughts, she's gotten really good at it. So that was an opportunity. I didn't discount her anxious feelings. I didn't try to mask her anxious feelings. I didn't try to make her feel anything different, because I knew that false alarm button has already been hit in her body and she's going to feel those things. Now, we do breathing, and I'll say, let's, take some deep breaths, cool down the cookies, smell the pizza, cool down the cookies, whatever works for you. We do that because that does kind of help reset the false alarm in the body. But I'm mainly working with her thoughts and getting her to accept that she's going to have these anxious feelings for a little while, and that's okay. It's okay to feel nervous, but we're still going to do these hard things. So it's a weird one, but you want to be careful about conveying to your child in some way, inadvertently, that to feel anxious is not okay. The other thing I want to mention before we get off this point is our goal with our kids, and my goal in therapy and with my own children, is not to get rid of anxiety. Anxiety is a normal thing, and even to the level that they feel it, they might feel it more intensely than the average person. I feel anxiety more intensely than the average person, but I also feel a lot of other things more intensely. I feel love more intensely. I feel joy more intensely. I feel people's emotions more intensely. I'm just more intense, and so are a lot of anxious people. And those are good things, minus the anxiety. So I may not be able to reduce the level of intensity that I'm going to feel when you put me in a situation that's going to trigger my anxiety, but it's what I do with that. And so we're not trying to eradicate anxiety in our kids, because we don't have the power to do that. But what we do have the power to train them to do is to fight back and reframe their thinking, accept the anxious feelings, and do hard things anyway. And that's amazing. And when you do that, and you do it often, you stop having those really intense physiological responses as often. So a lot of times parents will gauge success by how anxious their child is. Oh, Natasha, I don't think we're doing well because she was really anxious last night. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. What did she do? Well, she did this really hard thing. She got through it, but she was really nervous the whole time. Well, that's actually success, because we're not gauging on whether she was nervous. We're gauging on her ability to cope and tolerate that discomfort. And when she was able to cope and tolerate with that discomfort and do it anyway, that's a celebration. That's not a failure. So just remember that when you're dealing with your kids. Raising anxious kids is exhausting and it's tricky, because it is very counterintuitive, as we've discussed this entire episode. And so a lot of what is normal or typical, or your knee-jerk reaction or your gut reaction, is not the best way to handle it with an anxious kid. And I know that gets frustrating and it's confusing, but I want to leave you with this message that even if you do these things 30% of the time, 70% of the time you do the other things that we just talked about not doing, you're still doing phenomenal, because you have intention. You know what you want to be doing. You know what you want to be conveying. You know how you want to be helping. It's just not going to come naturally to most people all the time. It doesn't for me. So even if I can do this some of the time, then I call that a success. The idea is to just know what will be helpful to your child, to encourage them to work through their anxiety, and know what things aren't going to be helpful, and then try in those moments to do those things. You're not going to be able to do them all the time, and the idea is not to beat yourself up and go, man, I responded in the way. Number 3, Natasha said not to do that. That's not my hope, and that's not my goal. My goal is to educate you, to say, this would be a beautiful opportunity to teach your child this. Now, are you going to have those beautiful opportunities all the time? No. Do I? Absolutely not, right? But I do know in my head sometimes, this is an opportunity. Let me take this opportunity. And it's a beautiful moment when I remember and I'm in the right space of mind to be able to do it. It isn't going to happen all the time. It may infrequently happen, and that's okay. But understanding the responses that will be the most helpful is the best thing that we can do for our kids. And having forgiveness and understanding that we're not going to be able to have these perfect responses all the time is the best gift we can give to ourselves. So I hope that you found this episode helpful. I hope that you find the sparkle in everything you do, and I'll talk to you again next time. Take care.